Yo, what's going on guys? Dorki here, and I'm just making this video real quick going over commonly asked questions that I get on stream about bear tanks, mostly regarding legendary, talents, covenants, and even common mistakes that bears may make. So I'd like to first go over Ursox or UFR and how it compares to my 235 natural order as well. For the most of last push week, I've been using UFR, which has been proving to work really well even at the highest keys, especially when you combine it with Incarnation with talents. Now, here are the main strengths of using this legendary. When you're pulling really large or when you're using Incarn, you're unkillable for the most part. Whereas, if you're using natural ord as well, you have a very consistent survival because of the constant barks, but you don't have that extreme unkillableness that you have with Ursox. Also, another really big strength of Ursox is that you gain damage, whereas the Bark Legendary doesn't help with your damage. Now, for the most part, I would recommend most players out there playing Ursox combined with Incarnation. But it definitely does not hurt to have both. And I'll be going over which dungeons I feel like you're better off using Ursox or if you're better off using Natural Order as well. Now, when it comes to which legendary you should use, you should be thinking about, are you pulling large and where are the scary parts of the dungeon? So the other side, for example, you'll have a combination of both. There's a lot of single target large hits, which makes Bark extremely favorable, but at the same time, if you're doing fortified and you're pulling very large in this dungeon, which you can a lot of times because there's a lot of big pulls, Ursox is really good here. So the way I would break this down is, if it's fortified, I would use Ursox, but if it's tyrannical, I would use Bark. For halls, almost always Ursox. There aren't any particularly large single target tank hits, but there's constant large pulls and the bosses aren't too deadly. The scariest part about this dungeon is the dog pulls, the pulls with the Gargans and the pulls with all the little groundskeepers. And Ursox is actually huge here. This is the one dungeon where I would always use Ursox. Mist is very similar to halls. You have constant large pulls and there's no crazy tank hit, so definitely use Ursox here, even if it's tyrannical. Plaguefall is the complete opposite of the past two dungeons. Plaguefall, you'll definitely want the Bark Legendary because you're constantly taking large tank hits. You have the Plague Borers, which are doing Wretched Phlegm on you. You have the little guys who do the Corroded Claws, I don't remember what they're called. And there's just a bunch of different tank hits coming from multiple different mobs. The Ursox Legendary doesn't help you too much in this dungeon. Now for Sanguine Depths, both legendaries are good. If it's tyrannical, you might want to consider using the Bark one, but for the most part, I would use Ursox. There's decent sized pulls and there's nothing too crazy in terms of tank hits from bosses, aside from like maybe the first and the third boss. For Spires, I would use Ursox because there's just not a lot of tank damage. So in general, in this dungeon, you just want more damage and Ursox helps with that. For Necrotic Wake, they both work really well. And this works very similar to the other side where you have large pulls, but at the same time, you have bosses who are doing large single target hits, where Bark helps a lot. So if you're doing Tyrannical, you might want to consider using the Bark one, where certain bosses like the third boss here, or even the first two, you might need Bark. Now, for Feeder of Pain, this one works very similar to Plaguefall, where there's constant large tank hits, and there's not really any big pulls. If you're pulling really big in this dungeon on like Fortified, yeah, sure, you can go for Ursox. But for the most part, you're probably better off defensively with the Bark one for certain bosses. Like the first one, Bark is really solid in to take those large hits from that one mini-boss, Decia. Gore Chop, of course, with the Hateful Strikes. Zav with the Brutal combo. And the last boss with Reaping Scythe. And even all the mini-bosses here, the Bark one would help you much more. So in short, you want to think about, are you pulling large or are you fighting small but at the same time there's like large tank hits? If there's large tank hits, you definitely want the Bark one. And if there's not much damage in general, like let's say you're doing lower keys, you might just want to use Ursox for the extra damage. Now for talents, especially these two rows. The most commonly questions are Galactic Guardian or Incarn. For the most part, you should just go with Incarn. Galactic Guardian helps with your damage a tiny bit, but it's really not worth it. Especially if you're playing with UFR, Incarn allows you to just sit into the pull for almost the entire duration of it, which is 30 whole seconds. For this roll down here, if you're playing Ursox, always Earth Warden. If you're playing the Bark Legendary, you might want to decide between the two. If there's constant tank hits, like Plaguefall for example, you will want Survival of the Fittest. But if there really aren't too many tank hits or nothing that may potentially kill you, you're better off going Earth Warden just to mitigate more damage. Now, what about Affinity? Balance Affinity versus Resto Affinity. For the most part, I've been using Balance Affinity, not just because of the extended range, but because of Typhoon as well. It comes down to having 3 extra yards on your Thrash, Swipe, everything else, and Typhoon versus Ysero's Gift and Ursul's. So for Balance Affinity, you don't even need to use Moonkin form. A lot of times, just being out of melee range of the mobs and using Swipe and Thrash is enough. That alone makes you take no damage versus having to tank the pull with Resto Affinity. And Typhoon for the most part has been more useful than Ursul's. However, that doesn't mean that Resto Affinity is completely useless. There may be situations where you're doing certain bosses on Tyrannical that you feel like you want the extra little bit of HPS from Ysero's Gift, making this extremely useful as well. But for now, I default to Balance Affinity, and you do not need Heart of the Wild with that. I do use Heart of the Wild, but you can also combine this with Bash or even Mass Roots if you need. So for Covenants, like I've said in my guide video, they all work fine. But I would highly recommend Venthyr just because there are a lot of groups that don't have Venthyrs, making you extremely useful and high in demand. Venthyr, especially combined with UFR and Incarn, allows you to have massive burst every 3 minutes. But if you already have a Venthyr in your group, you can go with Night Fae, which is extremely versatile, it's good for all specs, strong defensively and offensively, but that would require a bit of Boomkin blasting to make it offensive. It's also extremely fun to use, but Necro and Kyrian works just fine if you rather play one of those. So what are the most common mistakes that I see bear tanks making? I would say the most common one that I see is using Swipe way too much and not mangling enough. There are so many times in AoE situations where bear tanks are just using Thrash and Swipe, but never mangle, and that's actually a huge rage loss. The second most common mistake, as stupid as it may sound, is not using Iron Fur enough. As a bear tank, you should honestly be spamming Iron Fur almost off the 40 rage that you get. Of course, there are situations where you might want to hold off on using the second fur, but for the most part, you should just be spamming your furs constantly. That is it for the video. This was mostly used to answer questions that I get a lot on stream. But if you guys have any more questions, leave it down in the comments below and let me know. But thank you all for watching and have a good one.